So we've been looking at the counterfeit. We looked at it through the history of ancient Israel, ancient Babylon, just briefly, through the changes of the Christian dispensation, to the rising up of the papacy. We looked at the scattering of God's people in the 1260. We lined that up with the scattering of the papacy after 1798, going into captivity. And now we've drawn our attention to modern Israel and modern Babylon. Understanding this counterfeit of modern Israel. So we traced modern Israel from 1798 through to 1989. We've condensed that to just this much of the boardwork. So we haven't gone into explaining all of the relevant dates and history, messengers and messages that God gave in that time period. We've just condensed that down so we have more space on the board. If we had a board this whole length, we may have kept that up there, but we've just condensed it. And now we're focusing our attention on the Omega history. So this is the Alpha history. You have this intermediate period here from 1844 to 1989. And now we're looking at the Omega of modern Israel. So we compared and contrast the Omega of modern Israel with the Omega of modern Babylon. We made the comment before yesterday's class that this is all the preparation from 1989 to the Sunday Law. This is all preparation. The preparation of God's church to do a work. So then we know that also when you see the deadly wound healed, prior to that healing, prior to the Sunday Law, when that beast does a work, there must be a period of preparation as well. Modern Israel is prepared prior to the Sunday Law. Modern Babylon is prepared prior to the Sunday Law. So we're doing a simple compare and contrast to understand what that preparation looks like. And we've gone to the reform line of the priests. Really, in our understanding of this, that we could not say the priests, we could identify it as the church. Before this study, we'd already looked at 2001 and identified Bergoglio, who became Pope Francis. But we understood that was a simplistic model. When we understand 2013, 14, all the way through to 2019 and now into 2020, we can see that the Catholic Church is in a civil war between conservatives and liberalism. Conservatives and liberals. And both of those factions have a pope to look to. You have two living popes. So when we do that compare and contrast, we know that Francis does not represent the first angel, but the second angel. So we're going to come back to him. We're going to revise that history and then trace the work of Francis from 2013 to 2019. And in that history, there's going to be just quite a lot of reading, to be honest. But please raise your hand if you have a thought or a question or somehow you get confused or lost in that. Today, we're mostly trying to lay down history. So we looked yesterday at the definition of a counterfeit. We said a counterfeit was an imitation or a forgery. So we know that this church, God's church, Israel, must be the true, it's the genuine article, and it's of value. Satan has come in and he's made an imitation of modern Israel. Imitation or forgery. You do this without the permission of the original creator, and the purpose of this is to deceive, because you hope to receive gain from the counterfeit that should have gone to the true. So God has a model, a way of dealing with his church, preparing them where he can present people with a gospel and draw them to himself. Satan is going to counterfeit or create a forgery of that without permission to deceive people and take those people who rightfully belong to God and take them for himself. Are we all okay with the definition of a counterfeit? And we said a counterfeit was how much like the original. If you have something true and then you counterfeit it, are they opposites? They're similar. They're as similar as the skill of the counterfeiter can make them. Does that make sense? So you have something that is of high value. You could have a 2,000-year-old pot, and someone is going to counterfeit that, and how good of a counterfeit it is depends on the skill of the counterfeiter, how close they can make it resemble the original. So we know that when we come to the counterfeit, not just here, but when we're tracing it through through ancient Babylon, through the history of the 1260, it's Satan's work to study the true and to improve his counterfeit. And I suggested without proving that he gets better at this over 6,000 years through practice. We can see that just with the time frame, 500 years, 100 years. Now he can anticipate these things much more accurately and quickly. So 2001, we have previously marked Francis, but we identified that in the history of success, Alpha history, this is failure. Moses history, Millerite history. Two histories of failure. When you come to a history of success, our primary example is the history of Christ. And when we come to that history, the end of ancient Israel, we find that you have both leaders raised up at the time of the end. We all saw that. 4 BC, you have the birth of John at the same time as the birth of Christ. Both leaders are introduced at the very beginning. So this is the end of ancient Israel. When we compare and contrast that with the end of modern Israel, we see at the time of the end, both leaders raised up. 1989, Elder Jeff and Elder Parminder. But this first dispensation, the first dispensation of ploughing, is the work of Elder Jeff, lining up with John the Baptist. They equal the first angel. So they do their work in the history of the ploughing. Then at the baptism, or 2001, you have the arrival of the second angel. Now they become more known. They're introduced, but they're still not going to work. They still haven't overtaken the leadership of the movement. We find at the first temple cleansing, in that history, you see the imprisonment of John and the beginning of the work of Christ. There is a transition in leadership. Lining that up with 2014, our Sunday law waymark. I want us to remember that. Transition of leadership at this first Sunday law waymark, the middle waymark, from the first angel to the second angel, from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminder, lining up with the change of leadership from John to Christ. So we know that this end of ancient Israel is the model that will be used to most closely tell us of our own history. We're not the only ones that know that. So when Satan is going to create a history of success for him, compare and contrast that with the end of modern Babylon. He's done the same thing. We have Ratzinger and Bergoglio, both first and second leaders, first and second angel, raised up at the same time in history. We saw Ratzinger, He's the leading theologian for the Catholic Church and has been for many decades before he became Pope. So if we just review, just briefly, as a theologian and head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Benedict gained the nickname of God's Rottweiler because of his rigid interpretations of doctrine. So he took church's teaching, he wrote about it, he codified it in a very rigid, firm fashion. And then he stringently enforced those church rules. As far as theologians of the last 100 years, the only one who has been identified as being more prolific is Karl Barth, and he's not a Catholic. Ratzinger is the leading, most prolific Catholic theologian of the last 100 years. So we see what he does to church doctrine, how he tightens up doctrine. In 2001, there is this growing awareness of something that has prior to 2001 been quite covered up, and that is the sexual abuse crisis. It's identified as many church historians as the greatest crisis the Catholic Church has faced in 500 years since the Protestant Reformation. We identified that in the history of the 1980s, 1990s, it starts to become more known, but everything is still done under confidentiality agreements. Still, I think in the United States alone, $500 million was paid out in about 10 years because of this crisis, and that has just escalated. Ratzinger is head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and in 2001 he approaches John Paul II and he asks him to give him, or this Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, oversight over every sexual abuse case and accusation worldwide. John Paul accepts that request and hands all of that responsibility of cleaning up the church to Ratzinger. Quoting, "Through the sexual abuse crisis reached its peak in the public sphere during Benedict's papacy, it really began 2002, it really blows into the open. 2001 he takes charge of it, 2002 it blows into the open. They say that the figure most responsible for ignoring this crisis and the mess of the church was John Paul II. He may be sainted, but he did nothing to clean up the church. In the context of his predecessor's deplorable neglect, Benedict does a little better. In 2001, he takes over jurisdiction of these cases. He begins to investigate high-profile cases despite Vatican opposition. And then when he becomes Pope, he becomes the first Pope to kick sexually abusing priests out of the church, excommunicating them. In the last 2 full years of his papacy alone, he defrocked 384 offending priests. Prior to 2001, this is John Allen, a senior correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. He says that prior to 2001, Ratzinger, in his few public statements about the crisis, just came off as another cardinal in denial. Didn't really stand out as someone who would deal with it. But after he took over this office in 2001, he began to speak much more openly about the mess the Catholic Church was in, about the filth within the church, and he became aggressive in prosecuting abusers. He is the first Pope to break the Vatican's wall of silence. Quoting, "He began to talk much more openly about what he described as filth in the Catholic Church and became much more aggressive about prosecuting abusers, and that has followed into his papacy, where we see him as the first Pope to embrace a zero-tolerance policy on sexual abuse, the first Pope to meet with victims, the first Pope to, in effect, break the Vatican's wall of silence on this issue. And it wasn't just children that were getting abused. There was massive amount of cases relating to the abuse and rape of nuns in monasteries. All of that had been covered up by the Catholic Church. And that issue, in comparison to the child abuse is still comparatively covered up. We read how in early 2005, Ratzinger makes these comments before he becomes Pope, that the Catholic Church is as a boat about to sink. It's a boat taking in water on every side. He says that it is as weeds in the field of the Lord. There is filth in the church. The soiled garments and face of your church throw us into confusion, yet it is we ourselves who have soiled them. It is we who betray you time and time again. Have mercy on your church, O Lord. So, he says there are weeds in the fields of the Lord. What dispensation is this? This is the ploughing, yes? What does he call the cases of sexual abuse? Weeds in the field of the Lord. So what do you do in the history of the ploughing? You start to cut those weeds and cut those weeds and hoe them in. So he talks about this abuse crisis as weeds in the field of the Lord. In 2005, we lined that up with 9/11. We saw that at the time of the end, you have both. 2001, you have Ratzinger beginning to clean up the church internally. At the same time, you have Bergoglio made a cardinal, and he meets the St. Galen Mafia that are going to be the group that support him and eventually help him into the role as Pope. So we marked both here in 2001, Ratzinger and Bergoglio. Then we marked in 9/11. It's symbolized by the baptism and the arrival of the second angel. It's here that you see Bergoglio. Now at this conclave he becomes much more well known. He's a relative outsider. He never, compared to all of these other men, what's unique about Bergoglio is he was never either an official of or working within the Vatican in Rome. He never worked within that Vatican complex. And that's unusual considering how, until recently, virtually all popes had to be Italian. They had to be at least Italian and then connected to that establishment. He's outside all of that establishment. In 2005, lining up with 9/11, you have the death of the leadership. It's a this way mark that we mark the death of the leadership, the old leadership. We went to the story of Saul, really just to remind you of those old studies that is one example that placed here the death of the leadership of the Adventist Church. Lining that up, you have the death of John Paul II, the old leadership. In that conclave, Ratzinger and Bergoglio are the two options. Bergoglio nearly gets in, but he does not have enough support, and Ratzinger becomes Pope Benedict. 2012, we have this history of the leadership of Elder Jeff, and in 2012 he rejects time setting. This is the crisis that you could say is a catalyst from his removal from leadership. Just as we talked about Moses striking the rock, we can line up the death of John, the history of Moses, and in the right application also the rejection of William Miller. We can line that up with 2012, see that crisis, and that was the catalyst for the transition of leadership long before any of us knew that had even occurred, that there was a transition there from Elder Jeff to Elder Parminder. And you watch the people that have fallen away in this history just prior to the end of 2019 as being all the people that could not recognize this change in leadership. By the time that I was publicly saying early last year, late 2018, early last year, I began to teach that Elder Parminder was the second leader and that he had been the leader since 2014. By that stage, I would suggest it's too late for people. you could see that the whole world was divided into two groups. There were those that were not really listening to Parminder. They thought that they had Elder Jeff. They thought they were safe as long as they came under the banner of Elder Jeff and FFA, and they largely disregarded or did not give weight to Elder Parminder's teachings. By the time the Midnight Cry message comes, and you start actually pointing to him and saying he's been the leader of this movement now for 4 to 5 years, people had already made their choice. And those that had not recognized his leadership in this history were all swept away. It began before many people were aware of it. But you have a transition of leadership there prophetically identified because of the failure of Elder Jeff. Comparing and contrasting that. 2012, there is a scandal inside the Vatican where documents, confidential documents relating to the private behavior of members of the Curia are released to the press. They show how corrupt and immoral the behavior inside the Vatican is. And the Catholic Church refuses to deny those allegations. Instead, Benedict launches an investigation himself. He tasks 3 cardinals with investigating these rumours. Those 3 cardinals are separate from the Catholic establishment, so they can go in very honestly, openly, and report what they see. That 300-page report that they bring to him was damning. It showed the level of corruption, not just immoral corruption where you had these orgies and brothels within Vatican walls, but also the financial corruption. As a result of this report and these leaks in 2012, an increasingly unwell Pope Benedict decides to retire, and he becomes the first pope to retire in 600 years. In 2013, he shocks everyone by announcing that he will step down. When he does that, everyone comes together again for another conclave, and they begin to vote on his successor. We spoke yesterday about Scolo. He's the Italian candidate, but the Italians had divided themselves into factions. They could not unite in support for him. So when the Italians do not unite behind their one man, you know that he's just not going to get in. So after the first vote, he really wasn't an option, even though he won that vote. The second runner-up was Bergoglio with 26 votes, and then there was Ouellet with 22 votes. Bergoglio was a liberal, Ouellet is a conservative. Forget if Ouellet is from the United States or Canada, but he's somewhere from North America, and that also added a difficult dynamic to that vote. They have a problem with giving the most powerful nation on earth, the United States, a position at the top of the Vatican. They don't like to do that. They prefer to keep it out of the hands of the United States historically. But Ouellet is the conservative, Bergoglio is the liberal, and this sets up a factional conservative-liberal fight at this conclave. And we spoke about how one cardinal, a lifelong friend of Ratzinger, would stand in front of his door the night before the vote and call for the election of Ouellet, saying Bergoglio is too old for this job. Really, what he means is Bergoglio is too liberal. Quoting here, "As for Bergoglio, the first vote revealed that he was indeed a strong candidate, stronger than many had realized. They hadn't seen him coming. There were many factors in Bergoglio's favor. He was known to be very holy, humble, intelligent, so they liked his reputation. Devoid of ambition, he had avoided the limelight, lived a simple life, and he had never lived or studied in Rome and did not have a Roman outlook. So that becomes important. He was not part of the internal establishment of Rome. He's an outsider to Catholic leadership." So when we talk about the overturning of the church leadership from the inside, isn't it always an outsider? Whether you have Christ, who wasn't trained in the school of the rabbis, or William Miller, they always come from those outsiders, particularly when you come to the second angel. So when you see Francis, he was an outsider. He'd never lived or studied in Rome, did not have a Roman outlook. And that's extremely unusual for such a person to become Pope. He had governed the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires for 15 years in a pastoral way. But ever since 2001, his stature had grown internationally. So it's in 2001 that they mark the beginning of the international recognition of Bergoglio. 2013, he becomes the Pope. In 2014, he decides to call for an extraordinary synod. So when we talk about an extraordinary synod, do we all know what a synod means? I'll put it here. A synod is an assembly of the clergy. It doesn't have to be Catholic, other churches would have them, but it's an assembly of clergy sometimes also laity in a division of a particular church. You could substitute the word for council. It's an authoritative meeting of bishops for the purpose of church administration in the areas of teaching, faith and morals, or governance, church discipline or law. So it's an assembly of clergy to make authoritative decisions I'll reword that because it's not quite so simple. It's an assembly of clergy to discuss and propose. Now this might not be the same for every synod through different churches. I'm giving you how it works in the Catholic Church. A synod in the Catholic Church is an assembly of the clergy to discuss and propose an understanding on two different levels. The first one is teaching, faith and morals. And the second is governance. And again, I'm giving you the Catholic version of a synod. So at a Catholic synod, you have all the leading clergy, you'll have bishops, archbishops, cardinals. They come together to discuss and propose an understanding of teaching and governance. I can't say that they come to a common understanding or change rule or law. What they do is they propose recommendations or suggestions to the Pope. Teaching, faith and morals, governance, church discipline, law. An extraordinary synod is a synod that's called hastily, when one wasn't originally planned because it's felt there is some type of emergency in the church. So this is an extraordinary synod. It wasn't just a regular synod that they run through by calendars. This one was called in a fashion that is extraordinary or out of the ordinary. So it's a synod that Francis has called out of the ordinary working of their synods because he believes that there's some type of crisis or emergency within the Catholic Church. It's only the third such synod since 1965, the first in many years. It's not normal practice to do this. So if I was to try and work us through an example of what that looks like, if we were to try and do that, we could say that we're all in a synod. If you were all to take a title, you're an archbishop or a bishop or a cardinal, and I'm going to play the Pope. We'll see how long it takes people to clip that. So I'll be the Pope, and you can all be attending a synod. You would all come from your different areas of the world. You would come from South America, North America, Europe, Africa, Australasia. All over the world people come. They gather in the Vatican in Rome, and they conduct meetings where each one speaks and starts to give their view on the particular theme of the synod. And the synod that Bergoglio, that Pope Francis has called for, is a synod on the family. And when he's talking about the family, he's talking about the issues of how you treat homosexual people within the church, how you treat divorced couples within the church, how you treat those who are in relationships and living together but unmarried. All of these moral issues are what this synod is called about. So if we were to meet at a synod, let's say Sister Joy, she's representing Uganda, she's the Cardinal of Uganda. She's going to come to that synod at the Vatican, and she's going to present a speech before the Pope and everyone else representing her views and the views of Uganda relating to those issues. And then she's going to oversee a report made, not an exact transcript, but her views shared in that speech is going to be made and then shared throughout Uganda. This is the standard of the Cardinal of Uganda. Does that make sense? Here in 2014, Pope Francis begins to change all this. Particularly at this synod, he begins to manipulate. The first thing he's going to do is cancel that report. Now, Cardinal Joy can make a speech, but each bishop is given no more than 4 minutes. So she can address her views, present her views for 4 minutes and 4 minutes alone. Then, instead of a report being made of her views and sent to the Catholic Church in Uganda, that report is cancelled. This is out of the ordinary ways of running a synod. Instead, other people, allies of Pope Francis, are going to give some type of summary of this meeting and share that instead. So her ability to share her views back to her own people is blocked. This starts to create tension within this synod. They can see that Pope Francis is not open about what he believes. He doesn't stand up and say, I'm a liberal, I believe married priests should be able to be married, all of these different things. You don't find him say that. What he begins to do is manipulate. So the first thing he's going to do is call this synod, and then he's going to manipulate the way it operates. Quoting this was described, this 2014 synod, as a turning point, as a pastoral turning point for the church. I want us to remember that term, pastoral. They use complicated language to mask what they're doing. We need to be able to see through the language. So an American journalist, John Allen, described the synod as divided, with a vigorous debate between moderate to progressive camps that were pushing more welcoming language and conservatives worried about blurring church teaching. So this turned into a divided synod, a quite aggressively divided synod between progressives and conservatives, or liberals and conservatives. The debate was remarkably pointed and at times took on a nasty edge. That's a direct quote from John Allen. Each bishop had 4 minutes to speak, but was allowed to submit longer documents in support of his position. So he can speak for 4 minutes, but then he can present a document for those who want to read to the other delegates. Unlike previous synods, the Vatican is not releasing texts or summaries of the speeches of those 119 prelates, but is instead providing daily briefings with 3 spokesmen who are attending the synod and summarising events. So if we're all delegates, Sister Joy would have presented, and then her presentation would have been released in a text or a summary, so that all the people of Uganda could read it and know the views of their spokesperson. Instead, Pope Francis puts 3 spokesmen over the whole process and gives them the ability to give a briefing or a summary on these speeches. And what he does is he makes all these spokesmen liberals. So whatever she said, if it's conservative or liberal, he's going to twist it and give it a liberal edge. So he's starting to block the views of the conservatives. This is adding to the tension inside the synod. In this synod, they reinforce Catholic teaching. So they don't want to change Catholic doctrine. Pope Francis says we can't touch that. Catholic doctrine is set in stone. What they want to change is the pastoral application of doctrines. What does that sound like? So if I'm a pastor, the doctrine hasn't changed. The doctrine has existed for them about 1,500, 2,000 years. They have a doctrine for that period of time. What do I want to change? The pastoral application. What does that mean? Brother William. Dispensationalism. So if I'm a pastor and someone comes to me and Pope Francis says that rule hasn't changed, but how you apply that rule in a modern day setting with mercy and compassion is different. So they're starting to argue not about the original doctrine, but the modern day application of it. 2 leading cardinals attending the Synod on the Family have said that while a change in language on church teaching on sexuality is necessary, it does not mark a shift in doctrine. I want you to note here Cardinal George Pell. Do we all know who Cardinal George Pell is? He was the highest ranking Catholic in Australia. It's our top cardinal. He's Australian. Cardinal George Pell, the Vatican's prefect of the economy, and another cardinal, Dolan, Archbishop of New York, made their remarks at the Rome launch of a website at the North American College. So this is an Australian, George Pell, and a North American writing on a North American website. So if they're from North America, you know that they're conservative. And George Pell, he's Australian, he is strong conservative with a lot of power. He says they were reflecting on the discussions at the Synod, and they say everybody wants to show God's love and mercy, but it also brings you to very difficult situations, and as Christians, we follow Jesus. Says Cardinal George Pell, I confess that I might have been tempted to hope that Jesus might have been a little softer on divorce. He wasn't, and I'm speaking with him. So you have this tension develop between the conservatives and the liberals, and the conservatives were not silent. They knew that they were speaking openly against the position of Francis, but they were not silent, and George Pell was one of the most outspoken. He says that you cannot change the teachings of Jesus, and whatever I feel, I'm staying with them. Where is Cardinal George Pell right now? Does anyone know? There was not a single complaint, sexual abuse complaint made against him, but the Australian police force launched an investigation. They found cases, and he's currently now in a maximum security prison in Australia. I'm not saying that he's innocent. What I'm saying is that you have prolific amounts of these cases throughout the world, and Pope Francis has chosen very wisely who he protects and who he doesn't. And George Pell was sent back to Australia to stand in a courtroom that was all on camera, the media allowed in and thrown to the wolves, essentially. Charged with child abuse and sent to a maximum security prison in Australia. Not saying he's innocent, but what conservative Catholics are accusing Pope Francis of is using this crisis to protect those who are allied and loyal to him and to purge the church of those who are not. And I believe there is validity to that accusation. And this is one example. 2014, George Pell is not with Francis. Strong conservative. You come to now, and he's just one example of those who have not been protected. Of the bishops at the synod, 41 publicly expressed concern at the final document released. So once we've all met as cardinals, everyone has, or bishops, everyone has shared their viewpoints. Then you write, then a set of specially chosen people, chosen by the Pope, are going to write a report that we all have to give consensus and agree to. So Pope Francis is going to choose 7 people to give a summary of all the conclusions that we've come to at this synod. And he chooses 7 liberals. Those 7 liberals come from across the world field, but none of them from Africa. Why? Sorry? Because the African delegates are conservative. The North American delegates are conservative, the African delegates are conservative. If he finally, after people protested, he introduced someone representing Africa. These 7, and then he adds someone, they write a report on this whole conference, and everything is twisted, the whole language is twisted to support views that are more liberal than the delegates intended. So this creates a storm within the Catholic Church. If you can imagine cardinals in the presence of the Pope standing up and chanting for minutes at a time, this was war. 41 publicly expressed concern about the language of this report, particularly when it comes to what they're addressing here, homosexuality. They say that this report gave a seismic shift in tone towards accepting homosexuality in the Catholic Church. Associated Press Reverend James Martin stated in America that the language used represents a revolutionary change in how the Catholic Church addresses the LGBT community. According to the Associated Press, conservatives were outraged about a remarkable tone of acceptance extended to gays. Cardinal Stanislaw Gadecki called the interim report unacceptable and a deviation from church teaching, while Cardinal Burke, conservative, said the report had been manipulated. Manipulated by who? Francis saw that report and he approved it and sent it to them. So manipulated by who? Who are they accusing? They're accusing Pope Francis. So in 2014 at this synod, in the document, because the Catholics were so vocal and so aggressive, they're forced to change some of that language, and it was not as radical as the liberal faction would have liked it. But we find that fight all brought out into the open in this 2014 synod. Something else happens in 2014. One is the Synod on the Family. But there's another way that Pope Francis begins to undermine the conservative position. He sets up something known as REPAM. REPAM stands for the Red Ecclesial Pan-Amazonian Ecclesial Network. I think probably in Portuguese it might make more sense. What he's setting up is a special synod, particularly for the Amazonian region. The area of the Amazon has a number of issues. Its chief issue is that for the quantity of Catholics, they do not have enough priests to administer the sacrament. So what members of that Amazonian community want, which is quite a liberal area, is they want to be ordained priests. They want to ordain priests to administer the sacrament who are already married. So this would be the introduction into the Catholic Church of married priests. They also want to give women the right to do some of the job functions that have for the last 1500 years only been performed by men. So they want to bring women into leadership roles, and they want to ordain married priests. These are the type of seismic liberal shifts that have been the subject of debate all these years. So this is what those in the Amazon are asking for. So in 2014, Pope Francis sets up REPAM, and REPAM is just the organization, the Catholic network, that is going to start preparing for this meeting. And this meeting, the Pan-Amazonian Synod, is scheduled for the end of 2019. Everyone knows that the purpose of what is happening here from 14 to 19, this 5-year period, is preparation for this important meeting where they're going to start discussing, hearing the views, and then discussing the needs of the people in these isolated areas, and that the solution that these liberals are pushing for are radical liberal solutions that go against Catholic Church teaching. So this has been the war from 2014 to 2019. Everyone knows what this synod is about. And it's not just that area of the Amazon. The supporters of the introduction of married priests, the Amazonian community don't have that power. The power behind them comes from Germany. The reason that the power behind them comes from Germany is because Germany is liberal, strongly liberal. If you wanted to oversimplify things, it's North America conservative versus Germany liberal. So Germany is extremely liberal, and it's the German bishops and cardinals that are pushing these issues forward, wanting this Amazonian synod. And the reason that they want this introduced into the Amazon, married priests, the introduction of women into those services, is because they know if it starts at the Amazon, it's going to spread. If it starts in one area of the Catholic community, there will be other areas that see the need to implement that, and then it's only a matter of time until it's Catholic accepted practice worldwide. They recognize this as the first step. The Conservatives also recognize this as the first step. If you get these things passed and it's allowed in the Amazon, why is it allowed there and not in other areas? And they know it will spread. So in preparation for this synod in 2019, REPAM is set up in 2014, and they're working with many issues. The needs of church priests in these areas, the solution being those that are already married. But they're also working in the cases of taking care of Indigenous communities, human and environmental rights. So it also is a voice for the Indigenous communities of the Amazon, where the Catholic Church is taking an interest in their human rights as the Indigenous population, and also taking an interest in the environmental concerns of the Amazon region. And people here start to accuse Pope Francis of becoming political. The Conservatives don't care when John Paul is political, do they? John Paul can go into an alliance with Reagan, and no one cares then whether or not he is political. But Pope Francis is now doing it from a liberal aspect. He's now caring about human rights and the environment and climate change. And now all the Conservatives start to attack him, saying he's sharing or promoting a political message, and we're not a political church, are we? No, we're a religious church. So you have this argument develop. My brother. Repam? Red Ecclesial Pan Amazonica. That would be in their language. I'll write it here. The AM being combined. Repam, the final letters AM is for the Amazon. Pan, it's really like if you have, how would you define that? Pan Amazon, universal, encapsulates the whole territory. So this is for the Pan Amazon region, and this is relating to it's ecclesial, it's a church summit. Sorry? Pan-Amazonica Ecclesial Network. Thank you. So as part of this 5-year preparation, they create a school for the promotion of the human rights of these communities, their human and environmental rights. They support human rights defence cases in the court systems. They create a dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Indigenous community, and they start to fight for the protection of the 137 tribes in the Amazon who are not in regular contact with the outside world, affirming their right to live undisturbed. That in itself is liberal. If you're a conservative Catholic, you don't believe that no Indigenous community can stay isolated. They have to be brought into the church. But they're fighting for the protection of these tribes to live undisturbed. In 2014, connected to these changes that Pope Francis is introducing, you have these liberal cardinals and bishops who, for all the time of John Paul and Benedict, had been sidelined. They were the rebels of the church. No one listened to them. These liberal cardinals and bishops start to have meetings with Pope Francis. One of them met with Pope Francis. He referred to the communities of the Amazon, regretted that because of the great shortage of ordained ministers, they can only have the sacraments a couple of times a year. The Pope Francis then brought up the ideas of another bishop, that is to say, to ordain married men. So he's saying this was Pope Francis's idea. Pope Francis suggested to him, I heard this good idea, why aren't you ordaining married men? Pope Francis told this bishop, Bishop Krautler, Krautler, I think he's German, to make bold proposals with regard to the shortage of priests. Pope Francis is extremely clever with his language. When he's saying bold proposals, what does he mean? Radical, out of the ordinary method of operating. These two men, the two men we're just discussing, there was Cardinal Humes and Bishop Krautler, bring up the idea of ordaining married men in the 2014 Brazilian Bishops' Conference. September 12, 2014, REPAM is officially founded in Brasilia, Brazil. September 9 to 12. March 2 of 2015, the Vatican holds a press conference presenting REPAM to the public. 2017, Pope Francis convokes a synod of bishops on the Pan-Amazon region. It's just going to list the relevant dates. In Ecuador, there's the first gathering organised by REPAM, which discusses the upcoming synod. In January of 2018, Francis convokes the first pre-synodal council. So I just want us to see how much work went into preparing this synod. It wasn't something you did 6 months in advance. It took them 5 years of work to prepare for this synod. In March of 2019, REPAM went to Washington, D.C. in order to present the Amazon Synod and some of its main goals. The Jesuits were involved in hosting that group. All of this date-by-date history from 14 to 19 I've gotten from a website called LifeSite News. LifeSite News. This is a Catholic source. I want to quote their closing statement here. They've given an overview, a short overview of the history of 14 to 19 and the preparation of this Amazonian Synod. They say this short overview gives the impression that the Amazon Synod is being organised mostly by a close-knit group of people who have been working for years together, trying to advance their agenda that is influenced by liberation theology. I want to break that down. Do we know what liberation theology is? Liberation theology, the liberal part of that might already give you a clue. It's a movement. It's a movement in Christian theology developed particularly among the Catholics of Southern America. Where does Pope Benedict come from? Argentina, South America. It attempts to address the problems of poverty and social injustice as well as spiritual matters. So you have this term, this is the website, and they're introducing us to liberation theology. A type of theology that developed in Southern America among the Catholic community that believes that Catholics must not just deal with spiritual matters, but must also address problems of poverty and social injustice. That's why when Pope Francis, who comes from South America, and by the way, this liberation theology is a Jesuit theology. This comes chiefly from the Jesuits. He's a Jesuit and he's from South America. When he sees this, when he takes his theology of dealing with poverty and social injustice, is why he's going to create REPAM, preparing for a synod that deals with human and environmental rights. It's not just religious. And the conservatives, by this stage, are panicking. They know he's introducing this type of theology that starts dealing with social justice. Because when you start dealing with social justice, your position quickly is forced to move from conservative to liberal. So this statement, LifeSite News, it's a main Catholic news organisation. It says that by giving this history of 14 to 19, you can see that this Amazon Synod is organized by a close-knit group of people who have been preparing this for years, trying to advance their agenda of liberation theology. And who's part of that close-knit group of people? Pope Francis. They're essentially saying that this is a long-term conspiracy to change the direction of the church. And their whole reporting on this is decidedly negative, because LifeSite News, it's a Catholic news website, one of the main ones, and it's strongly conservative. So they're heavily critical of the Amazonian Synod, and with that, heavily critical of Pope Francis. So through these years of 14 to 19, 13 to 19, but particularly 14 to 19, when he begins to introduce these changes, it begins to develop into this more and more open civil war between the conservative Catholic faction and the liberal Catholic faction. And the conservative faction, do they have someone to look to? Who are they looking to? Benedict. So they all feel like they still have a leader in the Vatican that they can look to. Some of these conservative Catholics go so far as to say that Pope Francis has infiltrated the Vatican and is the Antichrist. They go on different scales of rejection of Francis. At the farthest end, if you were to look up, I'll find his name. If you want to see some of the most radical conservative Catholic views, if you go into YouTube and you look up Church Militant, based in North America, as you would expect, it's the conservative territory, and they are radical in their views against Francis. There's one chief teacher there, I just want to find his name, if I can. It's a North American man, one of their chief speakers. I can't remember his name. It's Martin something. It's later in the notes, so we'll come back to that. Quoting another religious site, the rhetoric against Francis is unprecedented in the last 200 years, said Jesuit Father Mark Massa. So they're quoting a Jesuit here. He says that the language used against Francis in the Catholic Church is unprecedented for the last 2 centuries. This is stirring up a pot which, if it boils over, may very well be guilty of schism. Do we know what schism is? It's a split of the Catholic Church. A complete split. They're afraid of the reform efforts of Pope Francis and are willing to do almost anything to align themselves with anyone to stop him. So he's speaking about that conservative faction, how they're afraid of these reforms, and we've just briefly touched on a couple of them, on this first Synod on the Family and then REPAM, both taking place in 2014, and REPAM being a progressive work up till the Amazonian Synod of 2019. This is when you see this split occur between those who follow Francis and those who follow Benedict. There's one very conservative Italian politician, and he was seen out wearing a t-shirt that said, "Benedict is my Pope." That's how open they get about it. That for them, Benedict is still their Pope, and they have complete rejection of Francis. So this Amazonian Synod opened in the last months of 2019, And it opened with Pope Francis welcoming to the Vatican a group of indigenous people from the Amazon region in their traditional clothes, traditional headdress, and with some traditional statues of a pregnant woman. So this delegation of traditionally dressed Amazonian indigenous leaders was welcomed at the Vatican. They brought these statues, these wooden carvings of a pregnant woman, into the Vatican. Pope Francis met with them. They had prayers, some type of ceremony, and the Catholic Church blew up. For all the conservative Catholics, what they believed they had just seen was Pope Francis welcoming all these people in strange clothing that did not look in any way Catholic, bringing Amazonian pagan gods, statues, idols, into the temple. So they were furious, so furious that one conservative Catholic took a plane, flew to Italy, flew to Rome, went into the church where those idols, statues were kept, took the statues of these pregnant women and threw them into the river in Rome. And conservative Catholics said he was a hero, that he'd cleansed the Catholic Church of this abomination that Pope Francis had introduced. So at the very outset of this Amazonian synod, it's war. And it becomes a public war. There's two Catholic news sites, primarily Catholic news sites that report on this history. I'll give you both of them. One is NCR. It is the National Catholic Reporter. That's what the NCR stands for. NCR, National Catholic Reporter. The other one is EWTN. That is, I think it's Eternal Word. Television network. So it's these two primarily. They're two of the largest. EWTN is by far the loudest voice in Catholic news, by far. And NCR, National Catholic Reporter, it's more online, but they're also a prolific news site for the papacy. They all operate independently. And they start to give different versions about what is happening. The reason they do is because NCR is liberal and EWTN is conservative. And they're giving opposite views of this Pan-Amazonian Synod. And what does that look like? What do you have now within the Catholic Church openly? Two streams of information working between NCR, really just supporting Pope Francis, and EWTN in support of Pope Benedict. So I want us to stop and just revise. The time of the end, you have both. You have Elder Jeff and Elder Parminda. You have Ratzinger and Bergoglio. It's Ratzinger that's going to become the leader in this history. The death of the leadership is marked in 2005, 9/11, and then you can see that he becomes the Pope. Bergoglio also in this history, he's starting to become known, famous, but he is not yet active, still silent. 2005, you have his arrival. Here he is an outsider, but he's recognized. He's the runner-up in that conclave. If it hadn't been for Ratzinger, Bergoglio would have been Pope here. So when you come to this, you have the arrival of the second angel. You have Christ at his baptism. They're recognized, but John is still the leader. John is leading through this history, as Elder Jeff was. Ratzinger is Pope through this history. But in 2012, you have a crisis. You have Elder Jeff failing in his mission. in this dispensation rejecting the prophetic message. In 2012, you've had this crisis within the Catholic Church, and it's a demonstration of the failure of Benedict. Elder Jeff loses his position as leader, so Pope Benedict lost his position as Pope. 2014, a transition from the first to the second angel. 2013, a transfer from Pope Benedict to Pope Francis. He is an outsider to the establishment. Elder Parminder was an outsider to the establishment. He immediately starts to introduce change, and you start to see silently, sometimes covertly, but still obviously these two sides developing first of all, we see that within the movement. You have the disciples of Parminder and the disciples of Elder Jeff. I think even Elder Jeff used that language. He recognized some people are Jeff disciples and some people are Parminder disciples. So you have these two sides. Sometimes it's not open, sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it breaks into the open in open warfare. Changing that to down here, Pope Francis starts to introduce a type of liberal theology. If you want to search for it, it has a name, liberation theology. It believes in taking care of the poor, of looking after human rights, of taking care of the environment. It's about human rights and social change. This guy hasn't moved, sorry. Human rights and social change, and it's whenever you go down that road as they are, this is liberation theology. It was founded in Southern America, but it's also a distinctly Jesuit theology. This is why the Jesuits have been known all the way through prior to the Second Vatican Council. They've been known as these radical liberals because they believe in this liberation theology, and it's just that Jesuit theology that Pope Francis is bringing into the Vatican. He does that with the Synod on the Family. Not only is he manipulating the outcome, manipulating church teaching, starting to introduce this idea of pastoral application being different to the doctrine. He's also starting to cleanse the Catholic Church of dissenting voices. And he's done that progressively from 2014, reached his milestone in that in 2019, which we'll discuss later. He also begins this repam, this preparation for an Amazonian synod. It takes 5 years, step by step, meeting after meeting. And through every meeting, they're introducing the idea of, as Pope Francis himself put it, some type of he didn't say radical change, it was something close to that. The idea being that you would introduce these liberal concepts that liberal areas of the Catholic Church have wanted for years. Germany for years has wanted married priests, women priests, acceptance of homosexuality, all these different things brought into the Catholic Church. They didn't want to excommunicate couples that were divorced. All of these different doctrines that used to be held 200, 300 years ago no longer are being supported within their communities. So they want to change the church teaching. For these 5 years, it's just an escalation of tension between these two factions. And in 2019, that breaks out into the open with these two separate streams. The liberal stream, NCR, the conservative stream, EWTN. These two streams actually break out into the open, by the way, in 2018. In 2018, that divide breaks out into the open, but it reaches a climax in 2019 at this Pan-Amazonian Synod. And you start to see more clearly these two factions, one saying, Francis is my Pope, another side saying, Benedict is our Pope. Just as internally we see one side saying, Parminder is our leader, and the other side saying, Jeff is our leader. What Elder Jeff teaches is that Benedict and Francis are as bad as each other. They're all wicked, no difference. The problem that I have with that is, first of all, when he says someone is bad, he means morally. I don't really care about their private morals. I care about whether or not they're good or bad prophetically. I don't use bad in the same context that he would use it. But if you go prophetically to the end of the world and you see, if you want to define good as the person who's going to be good for the purposes of Satan to accomplish the task at the end of the world, it is so clearly Francis. So if you go to the internal, he would never say that he is equally as bad as Parminder. He believes that he is the leading the true movement and that we're all Jesuits and satanic. He would never say that Jeff and Parminder are equal because he won't compare and contrast. He wants to say that Benedict and Francis are equally bad. They are not equally bad, they are not equally good. You have to be able to distinguish. You can only do that with parable methodology. Benedict began the work of cleaning up the Catholic Church. He was passed by. The second angel arrived. Francis will finish the work of restoring and restructuring the Catholic Church. The same way Elder Jeff did his work. He made a mistake, he was passed by. And it's Elder Parminder that we see take on this work of restructuring. Wouldn't just say this movement, but this is the restructuring of Adventism, preparing them for the work we must accomplish at the Sunday Law. So when we come back tomorrow, because we are out of time, we'll come back and we'll talk about 2019 and just tie up some loose ends with that synod, explain what happened, and then talk a little bit about this tension between Benedict and Francis. Do we have any questions on what we've done so far, brother? We read that quote. If I can go and find it. Pope Francis had never lived or studied in Rome. He did not have a Roman perspective. It's extremely rare in a papal candidate. You would have to be, it's not enough to be a Catholic insider, you have to be a Vatican insider. Does that make sense?
Now, how does that apply to Jeff and
When you come to the second angel, they're not insiders within Adventism. Always separate to the establishment. Jesus was not trained in the school of the rabbis, because he's coming up to overthrow that establishment. Pope Francis is introduced into the Vatican to overthrow their Vatican establishment. He's not an insider or part of it. Is that okay?
My question is on the side of the true stream information. So I want to inquire whether we can use the same principle that we do when we deal with the true stream of information when you are using the line of Protestants, that one is good, CNN, and one is bad, which is both news. Can you also apply to that one?
There are two streams of information for the world, two streams of information in the United States, if you want to take those two. There are two streams of information in this movement. The wrong stream has now left, but there has been. It's caused this divide. So at every level, whether we're talking about Adventism or the United States or the papacy or this movement, every single one of those is in a state of civil war. This movement has been in civil war. The United States is prophetically, you can see, in civil war. Adventism is in civil war. And the papacy. And whenever you have a civil war, you have two sides. So you have two different narratives. I think it's just, like you said, it is the same thing. It's demonstrating the civil war. Any other questions or thoughts? We've done. If you do, please let me know, because I know that I've done just mostly talking today. Tomorrow, I hope that we can actually have a proper discussion about the implications. But if you still have those questions or thoughts that arise between now and tomorrow's class, please either write them down and give them to me so that I can work them into the study, or approach me, my brother.
Okay. You have introduced agricultural model there. We have seen plowing. Now from 2005 to 2013 and until 2019 now, can we go ahead and introduce about the early rain, the latter rain, that the way we did in the genuine line, because that is the counter.
I would suggest yes. If this is Satan preparing his people, he's got a counterfeit agricultural process.
Okay, can we also compare the model that Pope Francis comes in about how they interpret their doctrine with how the method that Parminda introduces in the movement, again, how we look, and there is this war between Parminda and Jeff about the methodology. So in this also we can see the same war that is inside, how they read there.
We want to look at that particularly when we go over tomorrow over the Amazonian Synod. How they're discussing, in this movement, we would go to inspiration and we would try and decide whether or not that inspiration in its context, if it related to a past dispensation the same way it applied today. So it's dispensationalism, but it relates to how we interpret inspiration. When it comes to their fight, what they're fighting about within the Catholic Church is the same thing, dispensationalism, but not how it relates to inspiration, but how it relates to tradition. So, and they'll even state that. Are the traditions they've held to for 1,000 years relevant today? Or can tradition 500 years ago be different to tradition today? We would do that with inspiration. Is the application that Paul made, his quotes in his dispensation, is that dispensational to his time, or do we relate that directly to now? But we're always going to an inspirational source. They're looking at ancient tradition, but the argument is the same. The argument over methodology is the same. And that's part of this liberation theology. Francis would say, not openly, but those that support him who are more vocal, would say that the tradition of not having women priests worked 500 years ago, doesn't work today. So we can take some type of principle to do with the priesthood, but we must change the application. And we should know, if Satan's counterfeiting, 1989, do we have a female priesthood?
Yeah.
So you counterfeit that. What's the counterfeit going to try and do? Introduce a female priesthood. What's the principles of a counterfeit? It does not look like the opposite of something. It has to look as close as it can. So if in 1989 we're introducing a female priesthood, what side of this argument is the counterfeit? It's not Benedict. It has to be the side introducing these changes within the Catholic Church. They have a more difficult job of it than we do, because we can look at inspiration, see the dispensational restoration over 6,000 years. How can they go back to tradition that was tradition just recently and say that that has changed? Especially when John Paul, who wrote into pretty much with the pen of infallibility that there can never, will never be a female priest. That's the problem Francis faces. John Paul left him a very hard legacy to change because he was so adamant about conservative doctrines. They're having to be very underhanded in introducing these things. But the argument about dispensationalism is the same.
But it's the same thing that we're experiencing, how we read Ellen White inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we have with FFA is that we read literal. Ellen White says that there is literal Sunday,
Mm-hmm.
but we come in our time we change, say we have to read it dispensationally, and that is what is replicating in that line again.
It's a replication of the argument of dispensationalism. Yes, it's the same thing. Yes.
My question is that Pope Francis being a liberal pope, does it change the work of Catholic Zoo, their agenda?
What's their agenda?
Okay, like the format, how they work, or the agenda of bringing, still promoting their doctrines in the old world. Can it change that?
I don't quite understand your question, but I'll say this and see if you agree. You agree that Satan works by counterfeiting. You agree that he's been practicing that for 6,000 years. The problem people are having now is that he actually looks really good. He looks like us. And people in this movement are having trouble telling the difference between Francis and us. Because we look good, we think we do, and we think he looks good. What's their problem? The counterfeit runs close to the true, and the people in this movement can't even tell them apart. That tells you how dangerous it is, doesn't it? Wouldn't it be easier if we were fighting against a Benedict? It's for this movement to tell the difference between a true and a counterfeit.
I think that in the reference of saying in Revelation that it will do the miracle, if possible, to deceive the very elected. But if you see, we are teaching about the liberal, and we are also bringing like Pope Francis to be liberal. Sometimes it can confuse or contradict, but to me I see that even though it's a liberal, I cannot maybe say yes, this is liberal, because even if it becomes liberal up to the extent that we can eat in the same table with him, I still see that his idea is completely different with mine, because he's sharing for his own purpose. I'm also what? Looking after my what? Achieving my target. So the difference is only we have different opinion, but we are working in a same similar way. For one want to overtake the another one. It's becoming liberal to overtake me, so I have also to know how to go ahead, so that he cannot come closer to me, that he can overtake me. I don't know if you have put the point.
I don't know if I can repeat all that to the camera, but I think the essence of what you're saying is that this closeness does not make him your friend. It makes him a greater enemy, a greater threat. And I think there are people in this movement who are confused on that point. They think that somehow looking to Pope Francis and seeing this nice, liberal man doing the right thing by Indigenous communities and women, that somehow that's comforting. I think we need to stop finding that comforting. That's the essence of your point.
So mine just a simple question, because we know papacy goes to work at Sunday law. It also goes to work at Sunday law. And we know very well, we have seen the papacy and the daughter are two distinct entities last time in our previous studies. So we know already from our background or from our conceived idea that papacy was going to work with the United States. But currently, I don't know whether I'm seeing that because I'm running their own line. So what is the work of papacy there at Sunday law, and what is the role of protesting?
What people are struggling with, have been struggling with since we started these studies, is what it looks like. I don't want to address what it looks like, at least yet. I want us to see what is happening, what we can see is happening through the methodology and the lines in the history. If we can identify what is happening and have that concretely, then we can discuss what it looks like. But people are hanging their faith on knowing what it looks like. And I think that, not that you're doing this, but I know people are doing this. It's a dangerous approach. It's essentially saying, I won't believe it, I won't agree with it until I see it. And whenever we say that, by the time we see it, it's too late for us. So that's why I'm avoiding people's questions about tell us what it looks like. First of all, I want them to see what it is prophetically, which is why we laboured over great controversy quotes and Spalding again quotes, so people would see what it is prophetically and hang their faith on that first, primarily. Brother Willie.
So I just wanted to say concerning the issue of the role of the papacy at the Sunday law. For me, I think even if we don't understand how it's going to play out, we have parables, we have lines by using all the forms of parables, either compare and contrast to counterfeit. We see that it's going to play a role. So even if we don't understand how it's going to work, we should at least believe in what the lines have shown, that it has a role to play.
The quotes say it has a role to play. We place our faith
On the lines.
on the lines. It's not enough to say the quotes. The quotes are on a line. That's where our faith lies. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for our blessings. Father, we know that we live in a serious, in many ways dangerous portion of Earth's history. For so many years we have expected this time to be one of bloodshed and physical danger. But Lord, we are not properly aware, we are not properly guarded and cautious against the dangers that are costing many their souls. Many who are not seeing these things correctly, prophetically, Lord, that are already becoming, as we see the rejection of time, the rejection of the midnight cry, people who have already become dead men walking. Lord, may we not be lulled into any false sense of security. I pray, Lord, that you will put us on guard, that we will know the steps of the enemy. We will know what you require of us. Give us a greater faith in your leading, in your lines. I pray that we will be rooted and grounded in these things, so that when the future testing times come, we may pass. I pray, Lord, that you be with us through the remainder of our day in fellowship. In Jesus' name, amen.